Hello, I'm Bill Youngs, and this is History 498, the history of the American national parks. I'm proud and excited to be able to say that because in all my other years at Eastern and all my other classes, I've been in an actual classroom while saying it. I suppose you could say this is a classroom too, but it's a very unusual kind of classroom. Where I'm standing now is on Cape Disappointment in western Washington, and behind me you can see a lighthouse on the Cape. And if you look really closely, you can see the Columbia River and way across over to Oregon. This is the place, the area where Lewis and Clark first reached the Pacific, and where Clark uttered those famous words, "Oh, the joy," after all of those months of, and really years of crossing the continent to get here. And this is one of those places that has become a national park, also a state park. Where I'm standing now is actually state park land, but it exists along with units of a national park celebrating Lewis and Clark. And it's an example of many of the kinds of cooperative efforts that go into making up national parks. Now, we will be studying this quarter the history of many national parks and also along the way some of the state parks. During the past year, I've visited many state and national parks all the way from Maine and even up into Quebec for comparison with Canada, down to Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Indiana, across the Midwest into New Mexico, Colorado, Wyoming, up through Montana, and now Washington. And as the class starts, and the class as I'm talking to you now, it's Saturday, just before the Wednesday that our class begins in Cheney. I'll be working my way down the Pacific coast, and I'll be issuing reports in the form of what I call fireside talks. And I'll also be doing things like grading papers, taking part in conversations with you, discussions, and in a variety of ways teaching the class while in some of the parks and visiting the parks. I'll also be back in Cheney off and on. More about that later on. For the moment, I'd like to give you a quick overview of some of the places that I've seen during the past few months, and places you'll be learning more about as we go along in the class. This is a scene from Theodore Roosevelt National Park in North Dakota, named after probably the greatest environmental president in all of our history. We have here, obviously, a buffalo. And it's a reminder that animals are a very big part of national parks, and also that buffalo, though most famous for being in Yellowstone, are also in other parks around the country. By the way, I stayed safely in my car while photographing this big guy. And this is Theodore Roosevelt's cabin, the Maltese Cross Ranch in North Dakota, part of the national park, and it is a reminder that sometimes buildings are part of national parks, even the ones that emphasize Mother Nature. Speaking of buildings, where the heck are we now? Okay, let's turn the volume down. That's better. But what you just heard before is what you would have heard if you were a mill girl in the Lowell Mills about 160, 170 years ago in Lowell, Massachusetts. I was in Lowell in July of 2012, and I asked myself that question. Aren't mills like this the enemies of the parks that John Muir advocated? But it's a reminder that the parks are not just natural heritage, but also historical heritage, cultural heritage. And Lowell is one of the best embodiments of that. How's that for a transition? Right now, we are in Rocky Mountain National Park in Colorado. And I'm driving my rig. I said earlier my car. It's actually an RV pulling a trailer with a motorcycle in it. And the amazing thing about this highway is that we are at about 12,000 feet. I don't think there's a road in the state of Washington that goes much above 3,000 or 4,000 feet, at least in terms of a paved highway. But we're way up, as you can see, above the tree line in one of the great American parks. That looks like an interesting pullout up ahead. I'm going to pull over and take a little hike and take some photographs. Okay, let the slides begin. I've pulled over here to park. Note how steep the side there is, and what a job it must have been to construct this road up above 12,000 feet. There are my wheels, a whole bunch of wheels, and this is a favorite quotation that I saw on a sign along the path. I think I'll just read it as we go on through some of the images. It was by a woman named Anne Zwinger, and it's from a book that she wrote called Land Above the Trees. And here's what she said of this land. The alpine tundra is a land of constant and incredible intensity, where the sky is the size of forever, and the flowers the size of a millisecond. One of the things that makes the parks possible, and to me, and I hope to you as well, enhance their beauty, is the combination of words and photographs that people have taken over the years, sometimes early on to persuade people to make them into parks, and then along the way simply to celebrate their feelings and their experiences of being out in the parks. It was fun seeing other people. There weren't a lot of people. It was getting on towards dark, but up on the rocks there. And it was also great for me to be able to take a hike at 12,000 feet without feeling particularly tired, and that was because Colorado is so darn high. I'd been up at about 7,000 and 8,000 and 9,000 feet for most of the past week, so I was pretty well acclimatized by the time I got to Rocky Mountain Park and up into these high mountains. So it's the end of the day, and getting darker. I decided I better get down. Don't want to be at 12,000 feet, way above the tree line as it gets dark. And sure enough, there in the distance were my wheels, waiting patiently. Well, we're back now to the Pacific Ocean, where I began this little story of certain facets of the history of American parks. And looking at the Pacific here, this is near where I'm camped for the night, Sunday, just before class starts. And looking forward very much to doing our own little adventure. This is a beach very near where Lewis and Clark first finished their crossing of the continent and looked out at the ocean. And it's a nice kind of omen for what I hope will be a very interesting adventure with all of you in looking at the story of the American national parks.